They tell you to work hard. They tell you to put your head down, to grind, to outlast the next guy. And for generations, that was the gospel, wasn't it? The bedrock truth of an honest life, hammered into you from the moment you could hold a tool. You push, you sweat, you strive, and by God, you earn your keep. You build a life, brick by painstaking brick, through the sheer force of your will and the calluses on your hands. There's a quiet hum in the world, a deep, persistent thrum made by men like this, men who rise before the sun, men who pour themselves into the day until the last drop is spent, not just for themselves, but for every mouth they feed, every roof they mend. They carry the weight of their families, their homes, their futures, all on their backs, believing that sheer, unadulterated effort is the only currency that truly matters, the only thing that separates a dreamer from a doer. But somewhere along the line, something shifted underfoot. The ground got tricky. The rules changed, or maybe they just got too complicated to understand. That's where Vince found himself. 47 years old, a factory worker, his life carved out of hard labor and quiet sacrifice. You'd see Vince walking through the plant gates just as the dawn was a faint smear of pink and gray on the horizon, a lunch pail swinging steady in his hand. He wasn't a big man, not in the way some are built like brick walls, but he had a density about him like compacted earth. Every line on his face, every slight stoop of his shoulders told a story of weight carried, not just the heavy steel parts he moved all day, but the unseen burdens too. His eyes, set deep, held a perpetual weariness, yet beneath it, a flicker of something unyielding like embers in a spent fire. He was a man of few words, Vince. Mostly, he just watched. Absorbed, and when he did speak, it was usually a low, direct hum, cutting right to the point, no fluff. You could read a whole history in the rough texture of his hands, calloused and strong, permanently stained with the grease and grime of the machines he tended. They were workers' hands, plain and simple, and he'd used them to build whatever life he had. His world began with the shrill invasion of the alarm clock at 5 a.m., a sound that cut through the silence of his modest, slightly worn, single-story house like a dull blade. Maria, his wife, would already be stirring, the scent of coffee just beginning to warm the small kitchen. He'd sit at the table, Elena, their 17-year-old, picking at her breakfast, Matteo, 14, still half asleep over his cereal. A quick nod, a quiet word about school, maybe a grumble about the weather. Then out the door, into the reliable drone of his old pickup truck, heading to the plant that hummed with a different kind of predictable, tireless energy. The factory floor was a symphony of brute force and repetition. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the omnipresent smell of oil and burnt electricity. Vince's station was in the assembly line, wrestling heavy components into place, tightening bolts with pneumatic wrenches that rattled his bones. 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, performing the same precise, exhausting movements. His body knew the rhythm, the cadence of the machine, better than his own heartbeat sometimes. It was honest work, demanding work, work that paid the bills, but it was also a treadmill, endlessly spinning, leaving him bone-weary at the end of each shift. He'd come home, showered, scrubbing at the embedded grime on his forearms, then sit down to dinner Maria had cooked, the daily reports from Elena about her studies, Matteo about his sports. He'd listen, nodding, offering what little advice he could dredge up from his exhausted mind, but mostly he was just present, a silent anchor in their lives. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the perpetually needing something car, the ever-increasing cost of school books and clothes, they were a constant, nagging current beneath the surface of his quiet life, a constant reminder of why he couldn't slow down, couldn't afford to falter. He worked because he had to. He worked because that's what a man did. And yet, no matter how hard he pulled, no matter how much sweat dripped onto that factory floor, it always felt like he was just barely keeping his head above water. Inside Vince, beneath the stoic exterior, was a deep well of loyalty and a fierce, almost primal protective instinct for Maria, Elena, and Matteo. This was his driving force, the engine that kept him going when his body screamed for rest. But it was also the cage in which his inner demons rattled. There was a quiet desperation simmering, a gnawing self-doubt about his own potential, a fear that he was nothing more than a beast of burden, destined for nothing beyond the heavy labor that had defined his adult life. He remembered vaguely a younger Vince, a kid who'd once sketched out designs for furniture, a kid who dreamed of working with wood, crafting things with thought and care, not just brute strength. Those dreams were buried so deep now, under layers of responsibility and exhaustion, they felt like another man's memories. He'd see Alina, bright and eager, hunched over her textbooks, and a knot would tighten in his gut. He wanted more for her, for Mateo, so much more than this endless grind. He wanted them to have choices, to reach further than he ever could. But then that self-doubt would creep in, whispering that he was barely holding on himself, that he didn't know how to show them a different path because he didn't know how to find it for himself. He was trapped in a cycle, confusing sheer effort with true progress. The harder he pushed, the more exhausted he became, the more he burned out, and the less effective his efforts truly were. He was running on pure grit, but that grit was eroding him from the inside out. He kept his silence as always, but the questions burned within him. Is this all there is? Is this the best I can give them? Am I enough? The answers felt like a heavy weight pressing down, making it harder to breathe, harder to hope. And worst of all, he knew no other way. He just knew how to push. Vince often saw Alina hunched over her textbooks late into the night, her desk lamp a solitary glow under her bedroom door. He'd hear the rustle of pages, her occasional sigh. Lately, her diligence felt different, tinged with a weariness he knew too well. At breakfast, her eyes were shadowed. "Rough night, honey?" Maria would ask. Alina would just shrug, a faint echo of Vince's own stoicism. "Just gotta push through, Mom. Big test tomorrow." Just gotta push through, the words, his own words, hammered in Vince's head. He de-taught her that, hadn't he? By example, by relentless, unthinking action, he'd shown her that the answer to every struggle was simply more effort, more hours, more sheer will. He watched his bright daughter mirroring his mantra, and a cold dread began to seep into his bones. He saw her youthful enthusiasm dim, the tension in her shoulders growing with each day she followed his path. Even small dreams, like a simple beach trip Maria had suggested. Even small dreams, like a simple beach trip Maria had suggested for Alina's upcoming birthday, felt perpetually out of reach. A cheap motel by the ocean, maybe a day trip to the boardwalk. Nothing grand. But Maria had mentioned it with a wistful look, then quickly dismissed it. "Maybe next year, Vince, with everything." Her voice trailed off, but he knew. The rent, Mateo's new shoes, the car that always seemed to be making a new noise. Always something. And he was always working. He sat on the edge of their bed one Tuesday night, long after Maria had fallen asleep, the dim light from the hallway barely reaching him. Alina's light had finally gone out, too. He closed his eyes, his head heavy not with sleep but with the weight of it all. He pictured that beach trip, the way Maria's face would light up, the rare, uncomplicated joy on the kids' faces. He knew what it would take. A few days off, gas money, the cheap motel, food. And the thought of it, even something so small, felt like a mountain. A mountain he couldn't climb, not because he wasn't willing to put in the steps, but because he was already at the top of exhaustion with nothing left. He saw his own reflection in the window, a gaunt shadow against the night. 47 years old. Another year, another decade, another gray hair sprouting, another ache settling deep in his bones. And what had changed? He was still just pushing. Pushing the cart, pushing the load, pushing himself until he felt like a raw nerve. But the cart wasn't moving forward, not truly. It was just spinning its wheels in the mud he'd inadvertently created. That was the night it hit him, not with a crash, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. It wasn't about how much he was willing to push. He had that in spades. It was about where he was pushing and how. He saw Alina pushing harder just like him and getting nowhere but tired. He saw his own life, a monument to effort, but an empty one. He saw the beach trip, a simple, beautiful dream crushed under the relentless, unthinking grind. "Enough!" he whispered into the silent room, the word a rasp in his throat. It wasn't a defiant roar, but a defeated sigh that somehow carried more weight than any shout. Enough of this particular kind of battle. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a plan, a strategy, a map. All he knew was that this path, the one he'd carved with his own sweat and stubbornness, was leading him, and by extension his family, to the wrong destination. He couldn't keep going like this. The cart was stuck, and he wasn't just tired of pulling, he was tired of pulling in circles. The next morning, the alarm blared at 5 a.m. like always. His body tried to go through the usual motions. Coffee, quick breakfast, grab the lunch pail. But something was different. The quiet, "enough," from the night before lingered, a strange, uncomfortable hum in his chest. He felt exposed, like he'd admitted a profound failure to himself, and now the world was waiting to see what he'd do. At the factory, the familiar roar of the machinery usually swallowed him whole, blending him into the background of noise and effort. But today, he heard it differently. He heard the individual clangs, the rhythmic thumps, the whir of the conveyor belts. He was on the assembly line, fitting parts, a job he could do blindfolded. His hands worked automatically, but his mind, for the first time in years, wasn't just counting repetitions or thinking about the bills. He paused, just for a second. The line kept moving, of course. Another part came. He picked it up, fitted it. But that pause, that fraction of a moment, felt like an eternity. He looked at the sequence of his tasks, not just as individual pieces, but as a small chain. Could this be done better? Faster, yes, but smarter. It felt clumsy, inefficient. He was supposed to be moving constantly without hesitation. His ingrained habit screamed at him to just do it, to keep the flow uninterrupted. But he forced himself to watch, to observe. He saw the way the bin of parts was placed, requiring a slight reach. He saw the way the next station on the line sometimes got backed up, meaning he'd just be working ahead, creating a small pileup that someone else would have to clear. He picked up a part, put it down, picked up another, fitted it. His hands trembled slightly. This felt wrong. He was supposed to be working. But what if working meant just pushing faster without thinking? What if working harder meant getting more tired, but not truly getting ahead? For the first time, he didn't immediately grab the next piece. He took a conscious breath. He looked at the bin, then at his workbench. A small, almost imperceptible adjustment. He nudged the bin an inch closer, just enough so his reach was less strained. It was tiny, insignificant even, but it was a choice. A conscious thought applied to the task, not just brute force. The first day was filled with 1,000 such tiny, awkward moments. Moments where he wanted to fall back into the rhythm of pure, unthinking labor, where the effort itself was the goal. But the memory of Alina's tired eyes, of Maria's wistful sigh about a simple beach, pulled him back. He wasn't working less, he was working differently. It felt slower, almost like he was learning to walk again, each step deliberate, considered. He went home just as tired, maybe even more so, because the mental effort was new, a muscle long unused. But for the first time in a long time, the exhaustion felt different. It wasn't the same hollow ache of pointless effort. It was the weariness of beginning something new, something that just maybe had a chance of going somewhere. He had started to pull the cart, not just with all his might, but with his eyes open, looking for a path. Day 3 rolled in like a familiar, heavy fog. The initial spark, that tiny flicker of hope from the first day, was already dimming under the relentless weight of habit. Vince found himself fighting an invisible current, one that constantly tried to drag him back to the mindless grind. His hands, conditioned by decades, instinctively reached for the next piece on the conveyor, but his mind, still trying to observe, to find a better way, felt like it was moving through molasses. He caught himself rushing, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts just like before. He had to physically stop, clench his jaw, and force himself to slow down to think. It was exhausting, not the sweat-on-the-brow kind, but a deep, unfamiliar mental ache that settled behind his eyes. He stood there, a piston in a giant engine, feeling like a rusty gear grinding against itself. His old self, the one that celebrated sheer brute effort, screamed at him. "What are you doing, Vince? You're slowing down. You're getting soft. This is just a waste of time. Get back to work." He felt the familiar pull of inertia, the comfort of not having to think, just do. He saw the stack of finished pieces next to the guy down the line, growing faster than his own, and a spike of doubt, sharp and cold, pierced through him. Was he just deluding himself? Was this, smarter, work just a fancy way of saying lazy? He finished his shift that day feeling more drained than usual, the internal friction having worn him raw. He didn't even have the energy to nod much to Maria when he got home, just the usual grunt and a slow slump onto the couch. By day 7, the battle lines were drawn. Every morning, the 5 a.m. alarm felt like a personal challenge from the devil himself. Getting out of bed was heavier. His muscles remembered the old rhythm, the unthinking march, and rebelled against the new, measured pace. He found himself reverting without realizing it, only snapping back to consciousness when his back started aching from a poorly maintained posture, or when he dropped apart because his grip was purely automatic, not considered. One afternoon, a supervisor, a young fella named Mike who'd only been on the floor a couple of years, walked past. "Everything all right, Vince? You look a bit preoccupied." Vince just grunted, not meeting his eye. Mike meant well, but Vince bristled. Preoccupied. He was thinking, damn it. He was trying to change 30 years of ingrained habit. It felt like walking a tightrope across a canyon, and everyone else was just strolling on the wide path below. The urge to throw it all away, to just punch out and go home and never come back, was a physical thing, a tight knot in his gut. He pictured Alina's worried face as she sat hunched over her textbook, mimicking his own tense shoulders, and the knot tightened further. This isn't just about me anymore, he reminded himself, the words a silent mantra. He swallowed the urge to quit, picked up the next piece, and consciously placed it on the jig, feeling the texture, verifying its fit before the machine descended. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental, like pushing a boulder up a hill inch by agonizing inch. 2 weeks in, day 14, and the grind hadn't softened. If anything, it felt harder. The initial mental fatigue had morphed into a dull, persistent hum in his brain, like an engine running on low fuel. He wasn't seeing any grand breakthroughs, no sudden surge in his output that would justify this endless struggle. He was still the same Vince in the same factory, doing the same job. Yet, something was different, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He found himself making micro-adjustments without even conscious thought now, shifting his weight to alleviate pressure, arranging parts in a way that minimized movement, spotting a flaw in a piece before it even reached his station. These weren't grand revelations. They were tiny, almost insignificant efficiencies accumulated like grains of sand. He'd catch himself taking a deliberate, full breath when the old Vince would have just powered through. He'd even started noticing the small details of the factory floor, the way the light hit the dust motes, the rhythm of the other machines, things he'd ignored for decades. It was like he'd been driving with blinders on, and now, slowly, painfully, they were coming off. But the battle wasn't over. A couple of times, he completely lost his temper, slamming a wrench down, barking at a jammed feeder. He caught a reflection of his own frustrated face in the polished steel of a machine, a flash of the old, weary Vince, and felt a surge of shame. This wasn't the path. This wasn't the smarter way. He took a deep, shuddering breath, leaned against the cold steel, and closed his eyes. Maria's quiet strength, Alina's hopeful ambition, Mateo's innocent trust, they flickered behind his eyelids, anchors in the storm. Giving up meant going back to the old way, a path he now knew with brutal clarity led nowhere good. His persistence, his inherent inability to quit, the very strength that had once driven him into burnout, was now the force that held him steady, pushing him forward, one conscious, difficult step at a time. He was still pulling the cart, but now he was also starting to learn its balance, its weight, and the subtle ways it could be made to move more freely. The internal friction of old habits against new intentions churned within Vince, a relentless battle waged in the quiet corners of his mind and the aching sinews of his body. But as the days stretched into weeks, something subtle yet profound began to shift. It wasn't a sudden seismic jolt, but more like the slow, steady turning of a massive flywheel, once stagnant, now gaining a quiet, undeniable hum. He still arrived early, still worked until the final bell, but the frantic energy that used to accompany him had mellowed into a focused intensity. He started to see the factory floor not as a collection of separate, demanding tasks, but as an interconnected system. He noticed how a slight tweak in the setup of the press on line 3 could prevent a backlog for the assembly station on line 4. He wasn't just clearing jams anymore. He was anticipating them, adjusting pressure gauges by a hair, lubricating a squeaky joint before it seized. These weren't grand, revolutionary changes, just consistent, mindful adjustments. He found himself taking micro breaks, not to slack off, but to step back, observe the flow, and mentally recalibrate. A quick stretch, a deep breath, and his focus would return sharper, his movements more deliberate. His coworkers, accustomed to Vince's grim, unyielding presence, began to notice. Young Miguel, who worked the next line over, commented one afternoon, "Vince, you look less like you're fighting a bear and more like you're wrestling a puppy." Vince just grunted, but a small, almost imperceptible warmth spread through his chest. Gus, the crusty supervisor, even stopped by Vince's station, watching him adjust a sensor. "Your line's running smooth, Vince. Smoother than it has in years." It wasn't praise, not really, but from Gus, it was damn near a declaration of sainthood. This external validation, however small, was a crucial anchor, a tangible sign that his internal struggle was yielding visible results. The exhaustion still came, of course, but it was a different kind, a satisfying weariness that came from purposeful effort, not wasted struggle. Hope, a fragile seedling, began to push through the hardened soil of his old despair, a quiet, insistent promise of something better. Weeks bled into months, and the changes in Vince solidified from tentative steps into a steady, powerful stride. He was the same man, the worn hands, the quiet gaze, the solid, uncomplaining presence, but through his eyes the world seemed different. The factory floor, once a place of relentless drudgery, became a puzzle he was constantly solving, optimizing, and subtly improving. His line consistently met, then often exceeded, It's quotas without the frantic, last-minute pushes that used to define his shifts. He even found himself chatting more with the younger guys, sharing an insight about a particular machine's quirks or a trick for a stubborn bolt. He wasn't just working. He was mastering his domain, becoming the quiet expert, the one whose opinion was sought out, not just his brute strength. At home, the transformation resonated even deeper. He still worked long hours, but when he walked through the door, he brought less of the factory's dust and more of his own presence. He sat at the dinner table, truly listened to Alina's anxieties about college applications, offering calm, reasoned advice gleaned from his own newfound strategic thinking. He didn't just tell Matteo to study harder, he helped him map out a schedule, breaking down intimidating assignments into manageable chunks, just as he now broke down his own work. He even started a small garden in the backyard with Maria, a project they'd always talked about but never had the time or energy for. The simple act of tilling the soil, planting seeds, and watching them grow became a powerful metaphor for his own life. The small family vacation, once a perpetually deferred dream, became a reality, a week at a modest cabin by a lake a few hours away. It wasn't opulent, but it was theirs, earned not just by endless labor, but by mindful, directed effort. Looking at Maria, laughing by the campfire, or Alina skipping stones with Matteo, Vince felt a profound peace he hadn't known in years. His relentless energy hadn't diminished. It had simply found its true north, transforming into an unstoppable momentum, guided by purpose rather than just brute force. He understood now that true progress wasn't just about putting in the time, but about applying effort effectively and sustainably. One evening, sitting on the porch swing with Maria, the last light of dusk painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Vince finally articulated the change that had taken root within him. "You know, Maria," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I used to think if I just pushed harder, I'd get there, like a stubborn mule pulling a heavy cart. Just keep yanking, nose to the grindstone, right?" He paused, watching a firefly blink in the darkening yard. "But I learned you can pull all day, every day, and still be stuck in the mud if you ain't pulling in the right direction or if the wheels are busted. It ain't just about how much you pull, it's about getting the cart rolling with a clear path, figuring out what's stopping it, fixing that first. Where's the mud? What's broken?" He turned to her, a soft light in his usually weary eyes. "Once you got that, Maria, once you get the path clear and you know where you're going, man, nothing stops you. It feels like the cart's helping you push, not just you pushing the cart, like it's got its own momentum." And so the quiet man, the one who once pulled until he broke, learned to guide. He didn't work less, he worked wiser. He found his unstoppable momentum not in the endless push, but in the knowing pull. For a man's greatest strength isn't just in his back, but in the vision that steers it. Some men lift the world, but the smart ones learn how to roll it. Maria leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand finding his calloused one, intertwining their fingers. "I saw it, Vince," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "I saw you pulling, for years, and I saw you hurting yourself trying to pull harder. It was like watching you try to lift the whole world on your own back day after day." She squeezed his hand. "Then slowly I saw the light come back into your eyes, not just the exhaustion, but something else, a calmness, a new kind of strength." She lifted her head, looking at him fully. "It's like you finally found the lever instead of just pushing against the wall." Vince nodded slowly, the fireflies a silent audience to their quiet communion. "A lever, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Or maybe just realizing the wall wasn't meant to be pushed through in the first place, but walked around or climbed over or even taken apart brick by brick with a plan." He thought back to the factory floor, the grinding noise, the relentless pace that had once felt like an adversary. He remembered a specific week, not so long ago, when a new production order had come in, a complicated one that would require a new setup on the line. Old Vince would have just thrown himself at it, working extra shifts, trying to force the existing process to conform, staying late, skipping breaks, pushing his team to do the same, all in a haze of mounting stress and dwindling patience. The result would have been mistakes, rework, and a crew on the brink of revolt. But the new Vince, the one who'd learned about clearing the path and fixing the wheels, had approached it differently. He hadn't just jumped onto the line. He'd stopped. He'd watched the existing workflow, talked to the guys on the floor, the ones who knew the machinery's quirks better than anyone. He'd spent an hour sketching out the process, identifying the exact points where the new product would bottleneck the old setup. Where's the mud? What's broken? He'd asked himself, literally mapping it out on a grease-stained pad. He'd seen that a single crucial component often got jammed in the feeder, slowing everything else down. Rather than just pushing more raw material, he'd spent a focused afternoon with a maintenance tech, redesigning a small part of the feeder mechanism, a simple tweak that cost almost nothing but shaved minutes off each cycle. He'd even suggested reordering the assembly steps, a small change that meant less physical strain on his crew and fewer errors. It wasn't magic. It was observation, reflection, and strategic action. He'd gone home that week tired, yes, but not utterly depleted. There was a different kind of satisfaction in his bones, not the weary pride of having endured, but the quiet contentment of having optimized. The production manager, a gruff man who rarely offered praise, had even commented on the smooth transition, crediting Vince's foresight. Foresight. That was a word Vince never thought would apply to him. He was a doer, a puller, not a planner. But now he understood they weren't mutually exclusive. His children, too, had started to feel the subtle shift. Elena, in particular, had blossomed. He'd remembered her poring over her textbooks, sighing, trying to memorize everything at once, her brow furrowed with frustration. "Just work harder, Dad," she'd parroted back to him one evening, despair in her voice. He'd seen himself in her, and it had twisted his gut. "Harder ain't always better, honey," he'd told her, sitting beside her at the kitchen table. "Let's look at this history chapter. What's the main idea here? What are the big dates? Don't try to swallow the whole thing at once. Find the path through it. Break it down. A little bit at a time with a clear stopping point so your brain can breathe." He'd shown her how to outline, how to pick out keywords, how to explain concepts back to him in her own words, and how to schedule short, focused study blocks interspersed with real breaks, not just scrolling on her phone, but getting up, stretching, even helping Mateo with his latest Lego creation. Her grades hadn't shot up overnight, but her anxiety had noticeably diminished, replaced by a quiet confidence. She wasn't just working. She was learning how to learn, how to apply effort effectively. Mateo, still young, mostly noticed the lighter mood in the house, the extra energy his dad had for a game of catch after dinner, the lack of that deep, bone-weary silence that used to descend on Vince after a particularly grueling week. He still worked hard, of course. The factory demanded it, and his nature demanded it. But the relentless push had been replaced by a powerful, steady flow. It was like he'd found the current in a river, no longer battling upstream with every stroke, but letting the water carry him forward, his own strength amplified by its momentum. "It ain't just about how much you pull," Vince repeated, the words echoing his earlier lesson, but now imbued with a deeper understanding, a quiet certainty. "It's about getting the cart rolling with a clear path. Once you got that, Maria, once you get the path clear and you know where you're going, man, nothing stops you. It feels like the cart's helping you push, not just you pushing the cart. It feels like, well, it just feels like everything is finally moving."